It's a real pleasure to get to speak with you all today. My time at Oxford and certainly the Weidenfeld group was, near and dear to my heart and was a huge part of forming my academic and professional career. So I'm really happy to stay connected however I can. As I said, we could spend the whole time talking just about that. But I am really glad to share some of my work with you. And I'll start off by apologizing a little because some of you may work on this issue a lot and know a lot about it, and some of you may work on something totally different. So it's kind of hard to know how to gear my presentation and comments to a crowd who certainly is really educated but may work in different fields. So if it's too basic, you can interrupt me and ask lots of difficult questions. If it's too challenging, you can interrupt me and ask for clarification. But the idea was basically just to share a little bit about my work and perhaps have some conversation about both the kind of nuts and bolts of it that's perhaps interesting and the deeper kind of questions and concepts and ideas underneath it. So as we said, I do kind of the hybrid work. I love keeping a foot in academia, staying adjunct and doing some teaching with Georgetown and the University of London most recently. Most of my courses focus on humanitarian work, refugees, and displacement. My doctorate is in international relations, so I tend to come at things from a more sort of political perspective, and I love to be challenged on that. So I welcome people who come from other disciplines as well. But outside of my academic work and research, which I really enjoy because you can ask the tougher questions and the deeper thinking, I also do some policy and advocacy with Refugees International, which is an organization in Washington, D.C., a nonprofit. The organization itself does not do programming on the ground like many humanitarian NGOs, though I've worked with a handful of those in the UN as well, but really focuses on policy and advocacy. And we've been really challenged with the COVID-19 lockdowns because our sort of bread and butter is to do field missions, go spend time in the field, X number of weeks, collect information, and then come back and do advocacy, mostly in DC, but also sometimes London, Geneva, New York, depending on the UN or the national government that we're trying to target. And really just to focus on protection and assistance and the rights of refugees and other displaced groups. So I've really enjoyed being a senior fellow there. It gives me a lot of latitude to write some sort of think pieces, but then also some more practical policy relevant projects as well. So I've been covering East Africa and the Horn, which there's a lot going on since more of my work experience was in East Africa. And then I also work on this labor market access project, which I'm sharing with you today, but it's going to have some crossover into my other portfolio as well. And I also work on IDPs, internally displaced persons. It's an interesting time to be working on refugees, IDPs, and other displaced groups. I think, certainly in the US with the Biden administration having taken off the ground, US foreign policy is shifting. There's a lot of really interesting opportunities. There's new staff coming into the State Department that's really knowledgeable and engaged on things like Ethiopia and other crises going on. At the same time, change is slow on the US government side of things. So pushing and lobbying for policies that we think are important that are going to benefit both refugees and the countries hosting them is still as challenging, not as challenging as under the previous administration, but still challenging. And then, we're also trying to produce lots of information that can be used on the international stage. So we do op-eds, we do briefs and research projects. Last week or the week before, I did a forum at Georgetown where we had a roundtable on the crisis in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. And I saw you all had a session on that as well, which I think is great. So let me dive in. I have a few slides to show you just a little bit about this particular project. But again, there'll be some crossover with other portfolios because I think it all does link together. And again, I welcome kind of broader questions about, the politics and policy realm that we're discussing. So I'm just going to share my screen. The Refugee Economic Inclusion or Labor Market Access Program is co-hosted by Refugees International and the Center for Global Development. The Center for Global Development is in Washington, and they do a lot more kind of economic policy and whatnot. So we sort of ideally complement each other. Refugees International doing a lot more of the hands-on kind of field-related type stuff, and CGD doing more of the wonkier policy econ side of things. Maybe some of you are familiar. Let's see if I can advance the slide. So just to give you a little bit of context, and most of my slides are not this dense, so apologies for that. But and apologies again if you already know a lot of this. But we're working in this broader context that I think is important to recognize why we undertook this project and why it's important right now. Largely speaking, most refugee situations and other displaced situations are protracted. They're considered, as UNHCR puts it, where refugees find themselves in a long-standing and intractable state of limbo. Their lives may not be at risk, but their basic rights and essential economic, social, and psychological needs remain unfulfilled after years of exile. Some 2/3 of the world's displaced situations are protracted. And again, they define this of 25,000 refugees or more in existence for 5 years or more with no prospect of a solution. So this first and foremost really sets the stage and in a way sort of challenges how we think about displacement in general. A lot of times, you have this image of humanitarian actors coming in, it's an emergency, and responding, in a very short amount of time. There's crisis, people flee, and then they can all go home. But in reality, we're talking years and years and years. Many cases are 20, 30 years, entire generations of people in this kind of displaced limbo, if you will. Now, it's not always limbo as in, they don't know what it's going to be one day to the next. Many people are, say, in a camp or a settlement or in an urban area for decades and decades. But the point is that there's not been a solution found, right? They haven't been able to return home. They haven't been able to integrate into society, whether that's citizenship or some type of visa that allows them to live and work there in a more sustainable way, or they haven't received resettlement to a third country. Those are kind of the considered solutions. And so this long-term displacement means that long after kind of the immediate crisis of flight has happened, there's questions about kind of the longer term response. And you can see how this is starting to lead into labor market access, self-reliance, access to livelihoods. Because, the first few days, okay, it's about having protection, shelter, immediate water and sanitation. But as the years drag on, it's much more about being able to support yourself and work and find access to the labor market. So that is an important setup. As I said, the durable solutions as we know them, return, people flee and then ideally they can go home is the ideal solution. That doesn't happen as often. We know that conflict is continuing much longer than we'd like it to be. People are not able to locally integrate as much as we would hope. Resettlement has been next to nothing. The US certainly cut resettlement slots where it was accepting refugees from other countries in recent years under the Trump administration. And we will see the Biden administration has, of course, called for re-upping resettlement, but even that is still a very small drop in the bucket. And besides the US, lots of other countries participate in it. But resettlement, by and large, as a solution, only reaches, a fraction, less than 1% of the global refugee population. So by and large, the solutions that we traditionally think of to displacement aren't working. So we've got people stuck for these long periods of time. A lot of solutions aren't working. Their political crises are continuing, conflicts are continuing. We should mention climate-related displacement is also, making numbers skyrocket. So this context is really important. Responsibility sharing is another kind of big concept that I could probably talk about for an hour on its own. It's a really interesting, if some of you're studying forced migration, maybe the concept that, refugee responsibility should be a part of kind of the entire global system. It's a global public good, as opposed to just being the burden on the one host state that is often the next door neighbor. By and large, most refugees are hosted in relatively poor countries that are unable to respond, don't have the capacity to do very much. And so the idea is that the international community, other states who by favor of geography may not be the next door neighbor receiving large numbers, but that it should be their duty to also share in their responsibility, and that we collectively, internationally, all benefit from a system where there is some type of response mechanism. And this comes out of kind of the World War II era, where we've seen, where we saw the modern global refugee regime emerge that we know today. And I'm happy to talk more about that because that's just interesting intellectually. But in terms of this project, I think those are kind of some of the fundamental things that sort of set the context for what we're doing. This is too dense, but I'm happy to share these slides later. It's actually a little outdated. It's the State Department. It shows some of the global protracted refugee situations. Of course, this would need to be a little bit updated, but I did want to give you some sort of visual. And again, the idea is that many populations have been in exile for many, many years, and solutions are really elusive. One other important dynamic that, again, could be a long conversation in and of itself, and maybe some of you study this, is this infamous relief development gap or nexus. Thinking about this sort of handoff from humanitarian emergency relief response to longer term development initiatives. And again, you can see where I'm going with this, right? Because if we're talking about labor market access, that does tend to be kind of a longer term conversation, a longer term initiative, thinking for more than just the immediate snapshot of humanitarian response. So, important questions of when does relief end? If the UN has been working in a refugee camp on the border and it's been 2 years, 3 years, does it now constitute, is it now ready to be a development situation, or does it have to do with, the emergency? Maybe there's new people coming in every day, but there's other groups that have been there for 5, 10, 20 years. Where I worked in Western Tanzania, this was often the case. Long-standing Burundian populations had been there for decades, but there were also new arrivals still coming in as well. And so when do we see this shift from the emergency phase? When do we see different actors, humanitarian actors, handing off to development actors to think about some of these longer term questions about how refugees can be self-reliant rather than needing emergency aid year after year after year? So, there's 2 columns here, and they kind of point out some of the differences that we would see between development and humanitarian aid. Development actors on the left side tend to work longer term models and projects and programs, tend to do more holistic approaches, more community engagement. They tend to work more with governments, and would do more on capacity building, kind of with the population as a whole, not just the displaced group, but the host community as well. Whereas on the right side column here, we would see humanitarian actors doing more of the immediate life-saving needs. They might be a faster deployment and then out, have more technical expertise, setting up water, sanitation, other types of systems. Governments may be more at odds with humanitarian actors who may ruffle feathers or cause problems that development actors with the kind of a longer term relationship may not have to worry about as much. So those are a few differences, I think. And again, this is important kind of groundwork to why this project is important. So the project itself runs for several years. It's funded by IKEA. And there's 3 sort of different pillars. We have a global research and learning pillar where we're looking at different data sets and really trying to understand ad hoc work on drivers, but also understanding public attitudes, financing flows, and policy shifts. So how refugees are perceived in these countries. And then pillar 2, we're doing country case studies. So we've looked at Colombia, Peru, Kenya, and Ethiopia, each of which are really interesting. On a side note, we've been a little bit challenged because there's been political upheaval in Peru. And of course, there's been political and conflict crisis in Ethiopia as well. So we're not chuckling because obviously these are really desperate situations, but it makes it challenging to do sort of this more kind of longer term look at some of these countries when suddenly things are changing rapidly on the ground. But that, I think, in and of itself is a really interesting point that I'm going to get to in a few minutes. So those case studies have been really interesting. And Colombia, if any of you study Colombia, has been a fascinating look at their response to Venezuelans. There's been a lot of recent development on Colombia being much more open and welcoming, doing things that other countries would not even consider. So there's been some really interesting aspects to learn from in these cases, many of them having longstanding displaced populations alongside new arrivals as well. And so we've done several rounds of research. And then we're also focused on advocacy and policy change. That means, we produce a report on Peru, on Colombia, and then we have meetings with the government and private sector and others to see what types of traction we can have on that type of advocacy. And then pillar 3 is private sector outreach. So we've been trying to connect with a number of different organizations and businesses to advocate for expanded economic inclusion. And that's where we're still really trying to build up. Maybe some of you are familiar with the Tent Foundation. They've done quite a bit on this and thinking about how the private sector certainly has a role in including refugees in the local economies. And the bigger picture idea here is that we know, academia, practitioners, the literature is quite clear. We know that refugees do not have to be this, stereotypical burden on the economy that they're often painted to be, or scapegoated to be this drain on resources, but rather come with skills and money to contribute to the local economy, to the local markets. I mean, just as an anecdote, even the aid actors can bring development to rural areas. Where I worked in Western Tanzania, again, this is just a small anecdote, but where refugees had come, I was in Kibondo, if any of you are familiar with the country, which was relatively rural, did not have lots of paved roads and airports, et cetera. But with the refugees and large refugee camps, of course, there were plenty of challenges, but it also brought along lots of international development actors and humanitarian actors who put up cell phone towers and paved roads. And again, there's complexity around that. It's not all roses by any means, but there are opportunities for development. And of course, the refugees themselves bring skills and whatnot. As we can talk about in a few minutes with some of the case studies, many Venezuelans who are coming to Colombia and Peru, especially some of the earlier waves, have professional degrees. Some are doctors and nurses, and there's opportunity there, especially as hospitals have shortages on, say, nursing staff to treat COVID patients and others. So there are lots of opportunities, and the idea is that it's a mistake to view refugees as only this, burden or drain on the humanitarian system. So let me just keep going. So here's just, showing our map of case studies. So, I think it's helpful to think globally and then, also work our way down to the case studies. And I won't talk too long because I know it's more interesting to have discussion. Let's see, we're already at 12:30. So, at a global level, we're thinking about how host country policies like labor market access and freedom of movement affect host community attitudes. A really interesting question. I didn't talk a lot about freedom of movement, but from a rights-based perspective, refugee access, the right to work and freedom of movement are really key here when it comes to becoming self-reliant, being able to support themselves, access livelihoods. So we're not just talking about an NGO letting people kind of weave baskets in a camp and then sell them for a little bit of money. We're talking about actual integration and contributions to the local economy. And so, we're trying to understand how host country policies can relate to host community attitudes, and also how the dynamics flow between international aid flows to refugees and host communities. We know that host communities, and you've probably heard this many times, tensions can rise if host communities feel like refugees are receiving lots of international assistance, attention, and aid, and opportunity, and host communities are being left behind. And that's a very real concern. Many of the places that are hosting refugees are as poor, if not poorer, and have less resources and opportunities than some of the displaced populations. And so this is a really important dynamic. The COVID context is its own sort of chapter. We've tried to put out some specific reports, updating our work and how to think about policy in light of COVID. Obviously, the economic effects of COVID shutdowns are massive, and so a lot of countries are suddenly, feeling this panic or this pulling inward to not be as open or generous or progressive in thinking about refugee inclusion in the labor market, because there's this panic around we have X many of our own citizens who've lost their jobs and who don't have access to the labor market. And so there's a lot of kind of challenges and debates around COVID. And then I would just highlight some of the emergencies happening simultaneously along long-term development initiatives. And I mentioned Tigray here because that's something I'm working a lot on, but Ethiopia is a great example of this. Ethiopia has hosted large numbers of refugees for long periods of time. It's home to a lot of humanitarian actors, NGOs and the UN, but also a lot of long-term development programs and initiatives, including international financiers like the World Bank and others who've really seen Ethiopia as open and, an opportunity for creative solutions. And I'm smiling because we all know that the northern region of Tigray has been an absolute disaster, and Ethiopia feels like it's coming apart at the seams right now. And so we have this sort of tale of two cities here, tale of two countries here, with an emergency happening simultaneously alongside this kind of longer term, perhaps positive development. For a long time, Ethiopia has been very open, not very, but somewhat open by comparison, to refugees being able to work and have opportunities for employment. And so while we emphasize that and encourage continuation on that line, there's also a lot of really difficult, challenging things going on the humanitarian side. And so now we're back to that kind of trade-off between humanitarian and development, and where do they kind of bleed together? Where do they, you know, break apart? So those are some of the global dimensions I wanted to mention. But of course, as I've mentioned, and I only have a few more slides so that we will have time to discuss, but you know, the program is really focused, the project is really focused on refugee access to their rights. I mentioned freedom of movement and the right to work being really kind of the core things that we are focusing on. And we recognize there are skills, you know, a range of skills to contribute. Some of the important takeaways from our case studies and kind of our general literature meetings, ideas, are that there's no one size fits all. Definitely at the, you know, at the country level, something like Ethiopia, even what works in Addis Ababa does not necessarily work in other regions, in rural areas. What works in kind of the camp model setting, maybe, you know, people being able to access financing or get work permits, may be totally different in another region. And it certainly is the case across countries as well. Peru is on the verge of, you know, a new government. And so the ways we're able to push on Peru is quite different. So it really requires a very dynamic approach to negotiate what refugee access to the labor market looks like. Formality and informality has been something we've really been challenged on. And that's because I think from an academic perspective, we privilege formality, meaning, you know, formal work permits and, you know, very official documents and things in formal workplaces, you know, whether it's a business or a restaurant or whatever, a formal established business. But in a lot of these countries, refugees and the regular population alike work in the informal sector. And so recognizing how can we advocate for access to rights, decent work conditions, you know, we're so focused on how can people get work permits? Well, maybe that's not even that relevant for a lot of people, because maybe that's not what the economy in that part of the country calls for. People work largely in the informal sector there. Maybe it's agriculture, maybe it's whatever. Maybe they make their, you know, money in cash. And so that has been something that I think has challenged us quite a bit. The role of the private sector I've mentioned, trying to figure out how to more fully engage and in some cases educate. You know, in Colombia, for example, many private sector, maybe a small micro enterprise, doesn't know that these laws have been passed and that refugees are eligible to work. I had done some work in Turkey at one point, and there was a lot of misinformation about what was incumbent on businesses that were hiring refugees. You know, they didn't want to hire refugees because they thought it would cost more for work permits, et cetera. And in some cases it did, and in other cases it didn't. But the role of the private sector is really important here. And for those of us who've worked in humanitarian and development sectors, we're not as good at that. We're not as good at connecting with the private sector and understanding how businesses are going to think about it, and helping them recognize where it's to their advantage and their benefit to work with refugees. Local government buy-in and whole of government approaches are really key things that we've been learning and focusing on. You know, you can have the most beautiful policy at the national level, but if the local authorities don't buy into it, you're not going to get very far. And whole of government, by that I mean, you know, across all ministries and offices. So, you know, many times those of us who work with refugees are used to dealing with, you know, just the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or, you know, whichever branch of the government is in charge of refugees. But the idea here is that it really requires, you know, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Peace, sometimes Ministry of Government, sometimes Health, Social Security. Really, whole of government has to be involved in this, because that does relate to certainly the labor market more broadly. You know, I've already talked a little bit about work permits. I think credentialing I did want to highlight. which is a really interesting and important thing that we're starting to work on. We're partnering with the Migration Policy Institute in Columbia to look at how to speed up and the benefits of credentialing refugees. So, using the example I gave about medical professionals, if you're a Venezuelan refugee, well, you may or may not have official refugee status, but we understand you to be a refugee, and you were a nurse, and now you're in Bogota or wherever, it can be a long and difficult process to get your nursing credentials respected in the Colombian medical system. And yet you may have a lot of skills to offer that are desperately needed in that labor market. So we're trying to understand how can we speed up, and maybe it would be too challenging to say, okay, well, a neurosurgeon, which is a very small portion of the population, but you can follow the logic, right? There might be some credentialing that requires just such stringent, boards and, approvals that may be out of reach. But if we're talking about other types of things, like just a basic nurse, somebody who can maybe put in IVs or do help with intake, things like that could make a huge difference. Certainly for the refugee population, having a much steadier income and not having to work in ad hoc or dangerous jobs where they're more likely to be exploited, but also for the host community where they could really benefit from that. So that's an interesting place to do some research that we're working on. And then there's, of course, the other approaches, traditional routes of vocational training, apprenticeships. So UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the ILO, and other parts of the UN, other NGOs and organizations have longstanding programs on vocational training, teaching refugees skills that are going to help them support themselves. And again, this all speaks to that broader context of long-term displacement, recognizing that donors don't want to support people for years and years and years, and more importantly, that refugees want to be able to support themselves just like you or I would. So those are some of the things that we've recognized. I did want to highlight just a few challenges, and sorry if I'm droning on too long. Let me see. Yes, we're getting short on time. One of the things that has really struck me and that is a challenge, and I don't know the answer to this, so I'm curious to have conversation, is that in humanitarian and development circles, we tend to fall into kind of a range of cliches, which I would say are very gendered professions and vocational type training. So for example, when I was in Turkey, I visited a women's center that was funded by the UN, and it was training Syrian refugee women. The idea was to help them, achieve certain skill sets where they would be able to support their families and have income, so they wouldn't have to be reliant on aid. They'd be able to contribute to their local economy and support themselves. Sounds great. Well, many of the programs they were running, in fact, almost all of them, were very gender stereotyped, right? So learning how to apply makeup or hairdressing, maybe, teaching. But at this women's center, there was not, engineering being taught. There was not more traditionally male-dominated professions or things that are perhaps stereotypically associated with men. And on the one hand, this makes sense, right? Because, the programs were initiated and run by Syrian women, refugee women, and just funded by, they really were designed and implemented by women. And that made sense for the cultural context that many of the Syrian refugee women were coming from. It wouldn't be common for a woman to be an engineer, at least for the Syrian women who were from, the particular areas they were from. On the other hand, there's a tension with this because, the UN and upholds gender equality. It upholds, certain values and rights and ideals and norms. And I felt a struggle with this because on the one hand, you have to sort of cater to what the population sees as relevant, what they want. It's not going to make sense to train somebody to be a, biochemical whatever, if that's not realistic for what they would choose to do or want to do or what's available in that, economy. Certainly there has to be understanding of what jobs are most likely to be available. On the other hand, it felt like it was sort of furthering what those of us in, kind of the US or Europe or other Western countries might take a little offense at by saying, well, why are women only being given the opportunity to learn how to be a makeup artist and a hairdresser? And that certainly isn't always the case, but I struggled with this tension a little. And I think it's an interesting debate on where to kind of draw the lines as we're thinking about training and furthering opportunities. I already mentioned the COVID context. I didn't add that refugees are also disproportionately affected by COVID, and they tend to work in jobs and industries where you can't necessarily commute via Zoom. So, besides also being more stricken with the virus, they're also more economically affected. And they're also more likely to be scapegoated, to be seen as, spreaders of the virus, whether or not that's true or not. Coordination challenges, that's more relevant on the humanitarian development actor side, which I think is interesting if you find kind of the UN and NGOs interesting. There aren't always incentives for development and humanitarian actors to work together to find ways to sort of bridge this divide and focus on access to the labor market and how to further refugee economic inclusion. I already mentioned some tensions with host as well, and then different funding cycles I'm happy to talk more about as well. And yeah, so just kind of closing with some questions. I hope I've at least given some interesting information and some of the debates and challenges that we're thinking about. I mean, this topic in particular, it's not just sort of its own little side project. To me, it relates to all of these other, I'm working on the emergency in Tigray right now, but it relates to kind of both the emergency response and the longer term. So how do we start planning now for the longer haul, which includes refugee economic inclusion? And so then what do we think about? How does advocacy look? What does it look like in this space? How do we engage with the World Bank quite a bit? And the World Bank in recent years is doing a lot more with displaced people, which is, bringing a lot of resources and a lot of money. There's pros and cons, right? The World Bank, occupies a very unique space in the development world, and is really changing the displacement landscape. We're also building up local partnerships to try to have more kind of on the ground access and advocacy. There's a lot of interesting questions around gathering data. And I would also bring in, what about IDPs? We're so focused on refugee economic inclusion, but what about people who are just internally displaced and they haven't crossed a border and therefore don't necessarily get all the same assistance and resources that refugees might? So there's a lot of questions. I've thrown a lot of information at you. I hope some of it has made sense and shows at least some of what the project is aiming to do. And I think, like I said, there's plenty of questions around the nuts and bolts. How do we search for policies that are going to really, move the ball forward on things? But also there's deeper questions about kind of the posture of international organizations and refugee inclusion in decision making around this, because here I am talking endlessly about what's going to be good for refugees, but how do we continue to have them sort of lead the process that makes the most sense for their situation? So I'll stop there. I'll stop sharing my screen and welcome conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this was a very interesting presentation, and I have so many questions, but I think I'll give space to the scholars. So Andres.
Thank you, Temi. Thank you very much, Sarah. It has been very, very fascinating to hear all of these, and your CV and your experience is truly inspiring and remarkable. So thank you very much for taking the time to come to speak with us. This year cohort, I'm from Colombia. I'm a career diplomat, and I'm doing the Master in Diplomatic Studies here in Oxford. And I had three general questions that I wanted to ask you. I know we have time constraints, so the first one is that you mentioned briefly about the response the Colombian government has had with the Venezuelan migration flux. So I was curious to see how you and Refugees International has assessed this approach, because the government has traditionally had a quite contentious relation with NGOs in relation to human rights, but in these migration issues, it's quite the opposite, that they have been able to work together on the ground and everything. So I'm curious about your general appraisal of this situation. The second one is that despite this like in general good this good performance, there is a critique that the issue has been addressed as migration, as not as refugee. So very, very few Venezuelans are granted refugee status and are mostly treated as migrants, but not as refugees. So I'm curious on if you could expand on this. And I see Samuel has more questions, so I'll just step there so we have time also to other scholars. Thank you very much again.
You surely know Colombia even better than I do. So it's great to hear that you're engaged on this as well. Yeah, I would say Refugees International and CGD, we've been really impressed with the Colombian government. Colombia, I mean, of course, no response is perfect. There's plenty of places for improvement, but Colombia has proven to be more open and willing and thoughtful. And I think there's specific leadership that has helped that along. I haven't been as involved in our, Colombia team as closely, but I think by and large, there's been a real sense of understanding that it's in Colombia's interest not to have large numbers of Venezuelans, sitting undocumented, unable to access the labor market in any way. I think Colombia has recognized that. I think you brought up a really good point about seeing it as a migration issue versus a refugee issue, and this is important. Throughout Latin America, most Venezuelans, for varied reasons, are not legally defined as refugees the way you would find in other parts of the world. And this is interesting for the international community too, because it relates to what types of rights and processes and assistance and labels sort of kick in. And so I think that's been interesting. I would be curious to see if you think it has helped or hindered the response in Colombia, if that refugee label is important or not. I think many Venezuelans, at least, I was there a couple of years ago in Colombia and Ecuador, and many that we spoke to didn't see themselves as refugees or weren't even really familiar with the concept of refugees. Now, that could be groups of people who were from more rural areas and didn't, think about it conceptually. But there's a question of, does refugee status help or hurt them? And in some countries, it really makes a difference because there's a whole range of, legal and socioeconomic rights that you can access if you have that refugee label. In other places, you don't want to be called a refugee. So that's a really important dynamic. But I guess in perfect academic nature, I would kick the question back to you, and I'd be curious. I know there's two others waiting, so I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on whether the migration refugee dynamic has helped or hindered the response?
Well, I have not worked directly on this issue, but for what I see, there are like two aspects. So from the political part, there should be refugee status also because there is an enlarged concept of refugee in Latin America. The Cartagena Declaration has a more broad definition of refugee than the universal status, so you could qualify them by that. But operationally, for the foreign ministry, which is the one that evaluates refugee application, we're completely overboard. Like refugees, they were like from 50 applications per year, it passed to, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000 per year. So it's has surpassed all capacities to process these requests, and it requires interviews. It has to be, as you say, like a much more detailed process. There has to be a committee that joins and has to accept the refugee status. And considering that there are almost 1.8 million Venezuelan refugees, it would be impossible to channel all of these through the standard procedures. So I think, and before this, we had not had like a big, like not even receive migrants, and much less on the refugees category. It would be like 50 per year. So there is not like a big infrastructure devoted to refugee. So I think it's like the practical solution is to handle it as a migration, because otherwise it would be even more complicated than it already is, which is enough.
No, I think you make some good points. And I think, a really comprehensive look at Colombia would have to also look at internal displacement because, of course, Colombia has had some of the largest numbers of IDPs for many years. And so that's also an important dynamic. And we've also, tried to, again, I have someone else covering the region now, but we've tried to really look closely at the needs of IDPs, and some of whom were still coming into Ecuador as well. So they're not IDP, now they're refugees. And so, there is still that dynamic as well that makes it quite complicated. But you're right, from just a purely administrative, logistical perspective, skyrocketing numbers like that make it a challenge. But yeah, I think by and large, we've been impressed with Colombia being a bit more forward leaning on this. And, you know, there's also this relationship, again, you probably know better than I do, between Venezuela and Colombia, you know, Venezuela having hosted Colombians, and, you know, population kind of back and forth. And some of the people coming back from Venezuela had, you know, fled Colombia years prior, not large numbers, but enough that it's a significant group as well. So that's an interesting dynamic as well. I've also tried to think about the population as not static, right? So, you know, there's groups of Venezuelans who are just passing through on foot. You know, they're caminantes, and so maybe they're, you know, just stopping somewhere for a few weeks, and then they try to get a day labor doing X, Y, or Z so they can earn more money to get a bus ticket onward to wherever. In other cases, there's people who've, you know, settled in an urban slum and they've been there for several years now. Venezuela is now considered a protracted situation. So clearly we're in for the long haul, unfortunately. That said, we've also seen and reported on some evidence of, as the economic situation becomes difficult, certainly with lockdowns where people can't work and support themselves, some Venezuelans have been opting to return because they're now unable to afford to pay any sort of rent or anything. And so, you know, while we celebrate that Colombia has been more open than others, to say that everything is rosy would also be a mistake. So yes, let me go ahead and let someone else ask a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So Sarah's agreed to stay another 50 minutes past the hour, so that you don't need to be anxious about skipping the queue. But please keeping the questions short. Samuel, would you like to go next? I think Samuel's video. Oops. Would you like to ask your question, Kesam? And then we'll take Samuel.
I'm back.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry, because Sarah, nice to meet you. I'm Samuel. I'm from Venezuela, actually, so I'm pretty glad that you brought up on. Yeah, my question is that, well, we have the examples of Colombia that have been pretty impressive, and I've talked with my Colombian cohort members that we're really grateful for that. You got examples like in Peru, where they have border police that is just there to make sure that Venezuelans don't come over Peru. Or you have the example of what's going on in Trinidad and Tobago, that they deport Venezuelans, or what happened with Chile, that they deport hundreds of Venezuelans in the weekend. So my question would be, what are the responses, what are the engagement with those governments from your organization? And if your organization is only based on research and follow-up, or do you also work with the implementation of set programs, such as the response platform that the UN launched with the UNHCR and the IOM on the Venezuelan crisis? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's great. We have Colombia and Venezuela well represented here. I feel like you guys could have a really interesting conversation of all the dynamics. I think you bring up some really good points, which is, you know, what I was trying to say. And even Colombia, though we give it praise, there's plenty of room for improvement. But other states in Latin America have definitely not treated Venezuelans according to, you know, international or even regional legal normative rights standards. Peru, you mentioned, has really had some really upsetting examples as well. I think, you know, we're all curious to kind of see how things develop politically in Peru right now, to see if there will be some, I've been told that at least we have to sort of be on hold for the next however many weeks until, you know, there's new government in place. But I think, you know, for us, you know, you're right, we don't do hands-on implementation programs on the ground. We do advocacy and research. And so for us, it is about kind of voicing a rights-based message. So refugee access to the labor market is a big part of that, but also freedom of movement and the principles that go behind the international refugee regime, right? So non-refoulement, the notion that people need to be able to flee. Maybe you don't hand out citizenship when they show up, but people at least need to be able to flee to a place where they have safety and access to basic rights. Recognizing that many of these countries are also struggling with their own socioeconomic challenges. That's where ideally the international community steps in. And apologies, my dog has just come in and he's about to jump on me. It's not my little kids, actually, it's the puppy. So you might see a noisy dog jumping on me. So yes, I actually was in Trinidad and Tobago last year, and found it to be one of the most worrisome cases we've really looked at in the Venezuelan response. And the interesting thing is it hasn't gotten much attention. So Refugees International dedicated a fair amount of, sorry for that noise, dedicated a fair amount of resources to trying to encourage the government there to, respect basic human rights, non-refoulement, so not forcing people back to a place where they could be killed, persecuted, etc. That has not been the case. Obviously, we've seen news reports that are really disturbing. A lot of loss of life at sea, women, children, etc. It's been a really disparate situation, extensive discrimination. And so, access to the labor market there is probably a long way off. I mean, we're honestly still fighting for very just basic respect of human rights. And so I think across Latin America, of course, the contexts are quite different. But I think, Latin America, in contrast to other regions where we usually work, has been recognized as being a more, rights-centered, more, again, not that that's necessarily been the case in reality, but at least having norms and structures in place, Cartagena, others, that should theoretically put it a step ahead. The question is how to really encourage states to follow the lead of countries like Colombia, who recognize that it's to their benefit to treat refugees well. I think our engagement with the regional platform has mostly just been kind of pushing, nudging, urging on certain issue areas and trying to be connected and kind of push our agenda as much as we can. But yeah, if we had lots of time, I'd be curious to hear how you think the response has been going, and lots of questions about, people you may be in contact with back home in Venezuela.
Actually, I have to jump off to another event from my program, but I'm from the public policy program. So I'm going to ask Temi to send me your email to get in touch, because I'm pretty sure a lot of people from the cohort will appreciate an event like this, and to have a one-on-one with you to talk about maybe possible collaborations in the future. So
great. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming. I'd love to connect.
Thank you, Samuel. Kesem, go ahead.
Just take the hand out. Okay. Hi, I'm Kesem. I'm doing the Masters in Refugees and Forced Migration, like you did. And I also worked in Israel with refugees on labor issues. And I think I have a bit of a complicated question, but there is a lot of emphasis about the accessibility of refugees to the labor market, which I completely agree with, and I think it's probably the most important right that a refugee can have. And sometimes other issues are being neglected, which is the rights of refugees in those in those working places, which usually are the worst conditions, the worst salary, wages, and sometimes even now I just heard a lecture from about the meat industry in the United States, actually, that are just dying in factories, and it's refugees that were placed there by programs to place refugees in working places, and I was wondering. And another issue is that sometimes, for example, with Uganda, the right for refugees to work is actually covering other very severe human rights violations that they're doing. So the international community is very satisfied with Uganda, and then allowing them to go forward with a lot of other very disturbing things that they do. And there is a friend from Uganda that maybe can speak about it more. So I was wondering what you think about these issues and how your organization is addressing them.
Thank you. Those are great questions. And you're one of the people I was speaking to who clearly, already knows a lot about refugees and forced migrants. So maybe some of that was a lot of boring review for you, but I think you bring up some important issues. So the first on workplace conditions, some of that I was trying to mention a little bit when I said, formality and informality. And even in the formal workplace, workplace conditions can be terrible, but certainly in the informal sector, refugees are often, unfortunately, the most exploited or, underpaid, you name it. Workplace conditions can be terrible for, host people as well, the host community, but definitely refugees may be positioned to be in poor workplace conditions as well. So this is actually sort of a new area for those of us who've done kind of the traditional humanitarian development stuff. And the ILO is really taking the lead with their kind of decent work campaign, which is trying to start addressing both formal work and informal workplace conditions. How much progress they're making and how much those of us in the humanitarian development sector are learning. So for example, how do you engage trade unions? How do you engage, migrant worker campaigns and others that we just traditionally haven't worked with in improving workplace conditions? That's been something we're trying to learn more about. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of success stories just because we're so new at it. I mean, everybody recognizes that workplace conditions matter. And certainly in these long-term refugee situations, as you said, access to the labor market is really among the most important, but how to really incentivize and encourage better oversight and improvement of workplace conditions, I think is a really important topic. The ILO does do a range of trainings. I did a consultancy for them once, and again, it was not my wheelhouse, but learning about, how they're training inspectors to go into a factory and make sure that it's safe for, both hosts and refugees. And this does start to, leak into all different areas of conditions for refugee workers as well. I think you also brought up a really important point. And again, I don't necessarily have brilliant answers to it, but I'm with you on these important points that, accessing the right to work does sometimes cover up other human rights violations. You mentioned Uganda. What's the other example I was going to think of? It just slipped my head. I can't remember what I was thinking about. But I think that is another really important issue. I don't know. Have you found people to really hold Uganda accountable that much? Because I feel like Uganda always gets so much emphasis as a success story, but then the nuances of, say, oh yeah, people can access the labor market, they can self-settle, they have access to their own plots of land, isn't always nuanced with the conversation about, say, they're given the land that nobody can grow anything on. I mean, some of the kind of details that maybe look good on paper, but in reality don't always fit the bill. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. One more thing on working conditions, which was these industrial zones that have been tried in. So Ethiopia was one, and then we've learned about them in Jordan, which was, or these industrial parks. This idea that we're going to build these spaces that are going to be for both hosts and refugees. We're going to get private sector investment to build, a factory or a complex or all this kind of this industrial park zone. And it's going to be this opportunity where, Ethiopia agreed to this, where X number of refugees get to work there and X number of hosts. So it's supposed to be a win-win for all. Well, in some cases, these can have benefits, but in other cases, they can be really problematic. So speaking of, rights and conditions, and now my son is coming. Hi, sweetie, I'm just talking for a few more minutes. You want to come listen? Okay, my 4-year-old son is here. I'm glad this is a small group. So these workplace conditions were really awful, and most refugees didn't even want to work in them. And some of us were thinking about, so in the Ethiopian case, it was the garment industry that was investing in these industrial parks. And some people who did kind of labor rights were like, great, we're celebrating, one of the industries that has one of the worst records on workplace, safety and rights, and we're going to celebrate that. That's where we're sending refugees to work. Now, for the most part, refugees didn't want to work there anyway because it was low pay, it was far away, there was no childcare, and so this great idea, which maybe in a different setting or context could work, ended up to not be very realistic and definitely was not focused on their rights. And what would be a realistic solution. So those are a few kind of rambling thoughts. I don't know if you had any follow-up on Uganda or any other cases.
Not on Uganda. I don't know a lot, but I'm thinking that maybe creating special labor opportunities, especially for refugees, is a very slippery slope. And like there is a very big difference between integrating refugees in the labor market and creating an industrial zone for refugees or placing refugees in a specific factory. And so I think that that's a very important distinction that I got from what you said.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, there's often this haste to, just find labor market opportunities and jobs, but it's actually a very complex equation to find the right type of work that matches the skill set, that's dignified work, decent work, that's not exploitative, that's not something that's going to cause a whole new host of problems. And so I think it's much more complex than meets the eye, while we might appreciate, and including Oxford, Alex Betts and, the Refugee Economies program does a lot on this, and you probably read it and connected. Alex was my supervisor. And so I think it's really important to kind of do a lot of deep thinking around what's going to work and what doesn't. And they also emphasize refugee entrepreneurship, refugees, building their own businesses. And so we're also investigating, for example, access to financing opportunities. So how can refugee entrepreneurs get financing to build their business, which can benefit everybody? So lots of interesting questions around that. Thanks for those.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take the last two questions now before concluding. And we'll take both questions at the same time. So maybe first Aaron and then Bivshika.
I just want to maybe comment on the Ugandan refugee, because I'm from there and I know something about it, but not specifically about West Nile, where there are a lot of refugees, but for northern Uganda, where some refugees are also hosted. I think the issues of giving them a progressive, like the right to acquire land, the right to work, I think it's just normal as any Ugandan for that particular region. It's just very normal. They can just do as any other Ugandan. But now the question comes, when someone is from a country which have a very decent work environment where they used to earn a lot, then they go to a community where they're hosted, and that community has very poor work conditions. People are poor. I don't think the community is able to meet the requirements or the job requirements that is in the international standards, per se. So I think that also has to be considered. Like when someone's coming from a very rich and good work environment to a very low resource community. Yeah, but from the area that I'm from, I think it's really very progressive, and they're just like any other person. The land is the same.
I don't want to put you on the spot, Aaron, but actually you told me about the international community and how they treat Uganda in relation to refugees and how it affects how the government is treating their own citizen. Or you don't have to speak about it if you don't want.
What do you mean?
That the international community appreciate the treatment of Uganda to the refugees, and then they don't speak about the human rights violations for their own citizens.
Yes, so that's also another issue that we talk about. Like the refugees are treated because they have like institutions to take care of them. They have the UNHCR, the other NGOs that speak on behalf of them. But when you go to marginalized communities and their rights are abused, they work like for 18 hours and they're paid like little money, but no one speaks for them. And so when you compare marginalized communities and some refugees, I think they're much better off because they're also peaceful and everything is okay for them. They're able to go to the capital city, open a business, and everything is okay. Yeah, so I think when you compare it in that way, I will say the refugees are welcome and treated better in some cases. Maybe there are some few cases of abuse when it comes to issues West Nile region, because they always fight for land with the local communities, because it's quite a big population there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to comment on this, Sarah, before taking
Sure.
Bifishka's?
Yeah. Sorry. I thought you said you wanted to take them together,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. You know, Aaron, I think you bring up some really important points. And to be fair, you know, a lot of the praise that the international community has given to Uganda is due because while it's not perfect, it has taken far more progressive policy stances than other countries, which many have just sealed their doors to refugees or, you know, kept very strict. I'm going to just turn off my camera and walk because my dog is being noisy. Just hold on. Everybody's getting a little wild in my household, so let me just go to a quieter place here. But you know, I think a lot of the praise is well deserved. I mean, Uganda has, you know, allowed refugees to make choices on where they're going to settle, and allowed them to, you know, have work opportunities that other refugees wouldn't be able to have. I think, you know, there's plenty of rights questions for both Ugandans and refugees that are still unmet. And I think I'd be curious to see, you know, studies on differences between urban areas and self-settled refugees and where they've been able to make contributions to the economy. And I know there's been a lot of research in Uganda, so I'd be curious. In fact, Uganda's next on my list to do some more research. So hopefully I'll be learning some things and maybe we can connect in the future. But you do make some good points also about when a host community itself has very low capacity. And that's where I think it's incumbent on the international community to really step in and help that community to do a lot more. If we're going to expect countries, this gets back to that concept of responsibility sharing, right? If we're going to expect countries to do X, Y, and Z and, you know, encourage access to a range of rights, then countries with maybe lower capacity or a community that is already very poor and doesn't have access to lots of things like, you know, healthcare or education, needs support in that. So those are some really good points. Was there one more question before we closed?
Thank you. Yeah, Bivishika.
Yes. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm Bivishika, a recent graduate with a degree in Nature, Society, Environmental Governance, and I'm from Nepal. And your presentation reminded me about, you know, returning migrant workers back to Nepal. And ILO estimated that there would be about over like 700,000 workers returning to Nepal, especially after COVID as well. You know, some of them are registered, you know, migrant workers, some of them are not, some of them have been refugees, but people are returning. But Nepal is not prepared for, you know, long-term job opportunities. And there have been discussions about, yeah, people should get into agriculture because that's what Nepal does, but you can't expect people to like start growing tomorrow and then earning for themselves, you know? And earlier in the presentation, you talked about, you know, the differences between development organizations and humanitarian organizations, and comparatively, the development organizations have a longer term vision. However, like being like a development worker myself, I think it's not really long term as we would like. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about, is there really a space in the development, you know, area? And what role do you see actors in the development world play? How can their role be re-envisioned to incorporate a very tangible long-term role to address the socio-economic needs of the returnees and, you know, refugees or workers? I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you. And clearly I'm migrating from room to room in my house. I went to my daughter's room, which I thought would be more quiet, and now they keep chasing me. So you're experiencing my migration experience for a quiet place. Yeah, you know, I think those are really important issues. And I've spent a small amount of time in Nepal, but I'd be curious to learn more about the case that you're describing. But I think the broader question about the role of development actors is really at the core of this. And so we've had a lot of, excuse me 1 minute. I'm sorry about that. I was not expecting to be chased all over my house. All right, we're back to where we started. We had about 2.5 feet of snow here. So we have a snow day. So the little ones are not in school. the grandparents are trying to manage remote learning. It's a circus here, but apologies. But, you know, all I was going to add to that was, I think you're hitting the important question, the nail on the head, right? So how to bring development actors in, and, you know, even like financing institutions like the World Bank, others are really taking an interest in displacement and starting to talk about how do we encourage access to the labor market. But, you know, we're apples and oranges in our conversations. Humanitarians and development actors are really speaking different languages. And, you know, I think it's most clearly shown by, say, the early recovery cluster failure in the cluster approach. UNDP was supposed to sort of take the lead on, you know, building some of the humanitarian programs into these longer term initiatives, which include labor market access and fostering rights. And we've really seen a huge failure. Now that's more IDP focused, but it also still relates to general humanitarian response. And we just haven't seen, that's not to fault any one actor. You know, UNDP is not necessarily to blame. There's a systemic problem there. By and large, you know, humanitarian actors have built up a system of response that sometimes works relatively well, but is not well suited to handing off to the long term, to working towards solutions, which development actors, as you said, it's not always, you know, temporal long term, but sometimes it is a different type of vision and a different type of community. They're much more interested in not just one sliver of the population, say, you know, just this refugee group, but a bigger population that needs assistance. So that's a very dissatisfying answer, but I think kind of a re-echoing of your point that we really need to kind of figure out how development actors can enter this space a little bit more. And that's part of what this project is doing, albeit humbly. But we are getting a lot of interesting traction and conversations with both humanitarian and development actors. And also I think actors like NGOs like Mercy Corps and IRC, who do both development type work and humanitarian type work, are well positioned to do projects like this because they have kind of both of those arms as opposed to being really siloed. So again, sorry, that's not necessarily the clearest answer, but I think maybe agreeing with you on the thought process there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, everyone. I think that's all the time we had today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and just to a few thoughts in random order about, so I will, yeah, just get in touch with you via email to ask for further permission to share your slides, which I'm happy to, for us to do that and to share your contacts with the participants of this call. You have also said how, you know, how many people are interested in this topic, both, you know, because of geography or because of like a profession. So if you ever, you know, if you come across opportunities that you think might be of interest to us, you can email, I think, alumni@refugee.org or contact us on LinkedIn or tell us so that we can share this with people. So yeah, thank you again for.
Thank you. Yes, I'd love to be in touch. And yeah, if we do have opportunities for researchers or whatever, I'd love to be connected to the group. You know, the project runs for about another year and a half, year-ish, but then hopefully it'll transition into other things. And you know, at the very least, maybe, you know, you have ideas or can share with your networks as well. But I really enjoyed getting to connect with all of you, and thanks for having me.